Hello, and welcome to the Capital Gains Show. My name is Aaron, and today we have a debate. My friend Ark was gracious enough to agree to come onto the show. We're going to have a casual back and forth and talk about what anarchy is and what the best way is to serve society with it, and what kind of anarchy is the realist, I suppose. Um, Anyway, Ark, do you want to give a rundown on your position and give us an opening statement?
Okay, so essentially, I have come into a form of anarcho-communism that would be considered anarcho-syndicalism. So essentially, it's when asked whether or not it's a planned economy or a market economy, I say yes because it's a mixed system.
Uh huh.
The union would decide that. Essentially, I think society is best when you enfranchise the most people, right? When you have as much people with as much power as possible. Like,
Mm
usually I give an about this. It explains anarchy in a nutshell, right? So let's imagine a society, right? In like a blank slate, right?
hmm. Mm hmm.
Everyone's the same size, everyone's the same gender, right? Let's get rid of all those. And then everyone's unarmed. There's no weapons, they didn't invent them. Well, it's for the reason that in that society, given no antisocial behavior, no one's going to act upon anyone. And the reason for this is they could reasonably come to harm themselves, right? Everyone's equally strong, so they
Mm hmm.
only unless somebody's compromised, no one's going to really attack anybody. Now
Mm
let's
hmm.
give everyone guns, right? And then we'll come to the idea that yes, in that society in which everyone has guns, that they're equal in power. No one's going to shoot anyone.
Okay.
Now let's uh, now let's take half the guns away. Well, obviously, now people can get harmed because there's
Mm
the ability to act where I will not be harmed if I have a gun, right? So now I get to coerce other people, given this power disparity.
hmm.
To the same ends if we take the same society and we pretend they don't even know what violence is, and they only know how to engage socially, right? Well, in this same
Mm
society, let's make 20 of them black, 60 of them white, and let's make 40% of those white people hate black people, right? Well, in that
hmm.
society, those black people are going to have issues engaging and interacting, and in that way, social powers can be coercive, just like the state is. And so that's essentially why I support anarchy.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good. Um, Now, I liked that example you use, and I don't know if I've heard it before, where you said, okay, presuppose a theoretical society where everyone's equal, equal height, equal gender, and all of that. It's an interesting thought experiment. No one, in that case, no one really has, I guess, the innate ability to take advantage of or coerce someone else. And then you differentiated it by saying, okay, now let's suppose maybe half of the people have guns or whatever, and then you pointed out correctly, obviously, that now those people with the guns have the ability, or it's going to at least be a lot easier for them to coerce the other people, right? If you have 100 gunfights where one person is armed and the other one's unarmed, at least 99 of those times, the guy with the gun will probably win, right? Maybe one out of
Yeah.
100, someone might get lucky and, pull the Bruce Lee kick or something, or the guy's, shot misses, but the vast majority of the time, the person with the gun is going to be winning that
Yeah.
battle, right?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
enables
Exactly.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I'm curious as to how that comes to the anarcho-syndicalism position, because the pointing out the inequalities of between people is kind of like pointing out the facts of reality. That it's similar to pointing out the fact that resources are scarce and so on. So
Give me a second.
um, so how do you uh, get from the fact that maybe some people have a proverbial gun, a metaphorical gun, and some people don't, and then you use that to conclude that free markets and private property rights are unjustified? You know what I mean? Because the anarcho-syndicalism position. Well, actually, I take that back, because you did say it was a mixed system, right? So I guess do you see some room for market activity and competition and things of that nature, and then you see in
Essentially,
in other areas there's room for the planned economics?
well, technically, the reason why it's called a mix is because you're putting in the hands of the union. So in that
Oh,
way, it's sort of structured. But
yeah.
essentially, what I want is I want needs out of the market, right? I want people's housing needs. I want people's um
Hmm.
food needs. These I want these be to be met as like verbatim in society, and so that takes away a lot of the things I deem coercive. And if you
Hmm.
looked at the example I gave, an example in which soft powers can minimize the way in which an individual is able to act.
I see.
And so that's where we come to the
I got you.
criticisms with the capital, right?
Okay, yeah, I think I follow.
And and so we can go if you'd like, we can get into the debate. I think I will discount the intro to the prescriptivist, and we could come back into that as we get time for that.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, so I'll give a brief definition of anarchy. An anarchy is anarchism is a socio-political theory which opposes all systems of domination and oppression, such as racism, ableism, sexism, anti-LGBTQIA, ageism, sizeism, government, and then do like a ellipsis. You get the point.
Hmm.
This is Nocella et Ella. I can't pronounce that. 2015 7. I think this is a very concise definition. I'll
Hmm.
make a few. So this essentially this just translates into abolition of unjust hierarchies,
Yes.
aka power structures, and I would make two corrections to this definition. The first would be I don't like the way they use like government haphazardly, because it then goes on to clarify that they in the bit I've read about it is that they're referring to centralized government. I don't like the fact they didn't use state there.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and then they talk about competition, which I think is a bit weird. I think what they mean is like a competitive economic, but I can't endorse that.
Hmm.
So
Okay. What I get what you're saying as well when you said that when you said mixed system you would there would be unions, and what you want to do is get the needs out of the market. That is what I hear a lot from the people on the libertarian left, like lib socialist, anarcho-communist, that kind of thing, where they seem to say like, well, markets aren't all that bad when it comes to maybe luxuries or wants or desires, but we need a planned economy to distribute the things that are deemed necessary, like housing and healthcare and so on. Is that
yeah,
accurate as far as you're
yeah,
concerned?
yeah, yeah. Essentially, that's what it's saying. Is essentially it's saying capitalism is coercive because
Mm-hmm.
of the fact that if I don't work and I don't buy things, well, I'm probably gonna die in a completely free market, right? And then
Yeah.
there's the social programs, and now it's the threat of like subsistence living and like um poverty,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Or
So, I mean, I'm interested in that part where you said, if I don't work or trade, I'm gonna die. Um, that I'm sure you've heard this before from anarcho-capitalists, where it's like, hey, that's just a fact of reality. It's not unique to capitalism, right? And now you could put on a piece of paper that says needs such as food and healthcare and housing are guaranteed rights, but if in your system everyone decides not to work, then they're all going to starve, and that's true in capitalism or socialism or anything like that, right? Declaring something a right doesn't necessarily make it no longer scarce, right?
Okay, so there's a lot more incentives to work within the new. This is also one of the
Mm-hmm.
reasons why I wanted to get it out of the meta discussion of this,
Yeah.
because we'd come to
Okay.
like foundational disagreements. But as a bit brief aside, there are several incentives to work. One, people usually don't want to live in a house with no electricity,
Mm-hmm.
no lights, right? They
Mm-hmm.
don't want to live in like these destitute engagements, right? One of the things Caesar remarks, right, is to keep the people in line, you need bread and circuses.
Mm-hmm.
Entertainment is a very important part of a system and something that people naturally crave. People aren't really satisfied just living a subsistence living, right?
I agree. All
Usually.
work and no play make Jack a dull boy, right?
No, that is true. So this is the way you can enforce that. That's the reason why you don't give needs away for free. Also, within
Mm-hmm.
as we head towards a socialist model, because I don't think that happened in our lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
right? We would be able to implement a form of production that required very few work hours, right? As we
Mm-hmm.
become a more and more like automated society. It just
Mhm.
uh anyway, that's my brother. He's a jackass.
That's okay.
Yeah, anyway. So basically, yeah, so
Mhm.
give me a second.
No problem.
I apologize.
That's okay, man. Real life gets in the way.
Well, oh yeah, anyway, so as I was saying, is with this is you get yeah, so essentially, yeah, you have ways of making people work, and
Sure.
it's not as though we just think that like everyone's just gonna go along, because anarchism actually, I think that it's mischaracterized that anarcho-communists are like idealists, and the reason
Mhm.
why is because we're saying, okay, we have these powers, right,
Mhm.
and we can't really expect people in power to just be benevolent gods, right? They're not just gonna like act in favor of the people just because of
That's
some
true.
principle, right? That's like a liberal lie, right?
That's true. I agree.
Um,
Yeah.
so we acknowledge that people will act in a form of self-interest, and so when that's why we make it impossible or near impossible for their needs not to also align with the needs of most people by controlling
Mhm.
the way in which power centralizes.
Hmm.
Anyway, so we can get into that. An argument for it. So I'll do the purpose of definition argument first. So, if it is such that anarchy is meant to maximize freedom, let it be such we focus on all oppressive institutions.
Mhm.
Let us not forget soft power is just as coercive and capable of sanctioning as that of hard powers. In an attempt to equalize and disrupt that of hard power, let's not forget that soft can convert to hard. Also do the same with oppressive social institutions. To this end, any understanding of anarchy will which will ignore the oppressive nature of the social powers around us, will leave us with the keys to a de facto state. You can go.
Mhm. Real quick, I think I know what you mean when you're differentiating rather between hard and soft power. But can you give an explanation real quick, or a quick differentiation between soft and hard power for everyone listening as well? How do you define soft power
So
versus hard power?
essentially, so essentially, soft powers are ways in which you are able to use the inherent implicit powers of social structures. Like, think money. Money isn't really money. It represents resources, your ability to get things, right? And so in this
Yeah,
way, I can use that to make you do things, to assert
yeah.
power upon you. A working or anarchist definition, as I use anarchy, that is, of power is the capacity to do violence, and violence is the capacity to effect change.
Hmm.
And so, if we use that definition of power and we then examine institutions, we can start to see several hierarchies form. And so I
Hmm.
gave an example of one with economics, and then another example is like a social power, the
Hmm.
interaction between black and white people, for example. This would
Hmm.
create a social strata based upon race. So there's a bunch of intersecting powers implicit to statuses, right? Taller
Hmm.
person is probably going to have a lot more have more power than a short person, just in the abstract, right?
Hmm. In the
And
I suppose, but aside from having like a handicapper general, like that one story where the ballerina rebels and gets shot down by the handicapper general. I forget the name of that story,
oh,
but
wait, I know you're
there's
talking about, yeah.
yeah, it's this silly story where like everyone's handicapped in various ways to make them all equal physically in terms of their physical capabilities. So,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
so
That's
yeah,
we get
and I mean if we say that tall people might have a certain advantage over short people, and I'm not disputing that, but if that's the if that is true, then it's kind of true that like nature itself is unequal in the hands that it deals people, right? The hand that you're
okay. So
dealt, and
could we
everything.
stop right
So,
there?
s
Okay, wait, no, because I do like going point by point with these things.
okay.
So you mentioned nature, right? That is not okay. So humans are a being that exists largely beyond nature. Would you agree with that? We're talking on Discord. We're talking on the internet. That's not. We didn't go
Mhm.
into like a forest and pick Discord off a tree. We weren't like searching, mining in the desert somewhere. I'm like,
Yeah.
finally. we discovered Discord. No, of course.
Uh,
So whereas I would see that nature has a host of inequalities,
yeah.
and I would also submit that a completely egalitarian system is impossible so long as you are if you don't go to an individual level, right? That's the only way
Mm-hmm.
that'd be possible. Like you need straight up egoism, right?
Hmm.
Okay. So to that ends, I think that whereas I would see that you can't do it all, we can start to
Hmm.
deconstruct the reasons why those things are. And
Sure.
you don't
Yeah.
have inherent societies that are as hierarchical as we are, as entrenched in gender as we are, right? So this means it's possible for humanity to exist beyond those things, right?
Yeah. I
To
agree.
some
To
extent,
some
right?
degree.
And so we
And
should move to that.
yeah, and over time
And
we're
so
getting
this is what
closer to that
deconstruction is.
reality, right?
Right, so this is what deconstruction is all about. So it's not like they're just saying, "Okay, we got to get rid of capitalism. Now we're no longer racist, sexist, classist, da 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 da." Right? That's not going to happen. That's like a tanky fantasy. Like the fact that all oppression is inherently sourced from capital. That's just a pipe dream.
Yeah.
These are interwoven, and even beyond that, there's ways you can oppress people, even if you don't control the resources. Right?
Yeah. I suppose so. Um,
Yeah. Okay.
well, man, uh, soft power. Um, if soft power is going to be things like, money, trading money and things like that, I don't know that soft power is necessarily bad. When you talked about money a moment ago about and how like you could use money to cause someone to do something, I wouldn't say that you're oppressing or coercing them or even exploiting them because if I have a lot of money but I need some food and you have a lot of food but you need some money and we trade those things, we both profited and we both caused each other to do certain actions. So we both used soft power on each other. You used it by way of giving me food and I used it by way of giving you money, and we both ended up better off as a result, right? In a situation like that, I would say that would be I don't know if it's really a hierarchy. I mean, we're
Of
hierarchying
course
each
not.
other, but it's more like it would be a voluntary instance of exchange, and those kind of things can happen. And that kind of mutually beneficial thing can happen in a market system, whether you're dealing with luxuries or with housing or healthcare. And it
Ooh,
seems to me
I'm
like the best way, the most efficient way to distribute these resources, whether we're distributing music or entertainment or healthcare or food or whatever, it would be to use that same kind of framework, ideally.
okay. So
Banning what I'm trying to say is like banning market interactions or competition or private property or capitalism in certain economic subsectors like housing or healthcare, just because you like those subsectors, is kind of like a form of special pleading fallacy. I think if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. If it's good for luxuries, then it's going to be good for necessities as well when it comes to
oh, I don't think
distributing
so.
those. But obviously you
Because
disagree.
wait.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, so we can get back into one of the things you said to me.
Okay.
You were talking about specifically the needs. So you mentioned we can have, if you have a bunch of food and I have money, I can pay for that food,
Yeah.
right? Well, in this situation where you are a powerful controller of money, let's call you a banker, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they are like a food mogul, right? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, no, no, no. There's no the equal powers, right? So there's like the old adage: negotiations cannot be held from non-equal standing. If I am
Mm-hmm.
more powerful than you, and that is actionable and usable power, right?
Mm-hmm.
I control the keys to that engagement. And at that moment, I am leveraging
Mm-hmm.
whatever power I have over you to coerce you into something that you wouldn't otherwise. We can use this as let's try to use a country example. Because
Yeah.
on the individual level, this is a little bit murky, right? So let's try to put this in a more easily consumable light. Okay,
Yeah.
so like imagine we have the United States and we have Uganda trading,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we do, right? So what we're going to do is America likes to do what is called a bilateral trade agreement, right? And so this is between two countries. The
Yeah.
reason for this is the United States is so unbelievably powerful that up until recently, the China debacle might have signaled the end of this our ability to do this with anyone.
Mm-hmm.
What we do in these bilaterals is we don't negotiate. What we do is we list out what we're willing to give them and what they're going to give us. And they either
Mm.
say yes and face either say no or and face sanctions and possible delegitimization
Mm.
and eventually removal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or they just accept our terms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this can be done so they in this case the hard and soft reinforce each other and they intermingle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in that you can't really tell me that Ethiopia has sovereign over itself in that trade agreement.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, that country is going to collapse if they don't deal with us
Mm-hmm.
or
Well,
someone like us.
yeah, I like that example you gave, but when I think about the mechanics of that example, it seems to me like it's more of a, more of a threat than an offer. I mean, to contrast, Little Caesars is not going to throw a Molotov cocktail on my house if I instead buy a pizza from Domino's. But I could certainly,
Wait. Okay,
imagine the USA threatening to invade a country that doesn't agree to its, demands, its trade quote unquote demands, right? The US has a known history of aggressing against other countries. That's obvious.
well, that's
Um,
true, but then we'd have. So remember when I mentioned intersectionality?
yes.
I don't think you can draw a neat line between soft and hard powers because they will intermingle, as I was saying.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Whereas it's true, but no, even if the United States, like with a country like Uganda, even if the United States completely fucked off the military and they didn't have a military,
Hmm.
Uganda's doing what the fuck we say, or we're gonna leave them out into the cold. We're gonna sanction them. They're done, right? They're done in the world,
I
right?
got you because we would cut them off from our markets or trade or
Yeah.
whatever, right? And you would
Well,
isolate
yeah,
them,
yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So
Sure.
essentially, like we would be able to do that anyway. I was just being honest in the fact, but in the corporation, if it gets the keys to power, what's stopping it from like taking swaths of land and imposing its own rules upon you, that type of thing, right?
Hmm.
So the only reason that the power is separated is because we have a system that does that. They would bleed over within, and they do because there's things like Pinkertons, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's whereas but you have to deal, and what there was notice when I mentioned the state, you have to deal with somebody like them.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's enough that you could okay. So like if you were a slave and you got to choose your master, well, you're still a
Mm-hmm.
slave, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure thing.
Okay. So we keep getting into the Give me a second.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, my sister's obnoxious.
That's okay.
Anyway, yeah. As I was saying is yeah. So we get into deconstruction. And so, this is where we haven't really gotten to your definition. Okay.
Mm-hmm. If you want,
Yeah. So
I can give a quick definition, my version of anarchy. Absolutely,
okay. Yeah.
it's
Because
actually very similar to your definition. I liked your definition, but of course, I'm a typical anarcho-capitalist, and in fact, there's another ANCOM on YouTube named Brenton Lengel that gave a really good definition of anarchy. Not too long ago, and it's basically what I say is also that yes, the burden of proof is on the one who wants to create the hierarchy or enforce the hierarchy. So all unjustified hierarchies should be opposed and refused, to be seen as legitimate. I'm not opposed to all hierarchy, period. It's about individual sovereignty, individual autonomy, and a consent-based economy where the only hierarchies that are legitimized are the ones that are consented to by all, by all of the relevant parties involved. So when you were talking about like the illegitimate hierarchies or the unjustified hierarchies, that's actually almost exactly the same as my definition, which I find refreshing. I think we're actually kind of there's a lot of similarity
then
there on our
we'd really
perspective of it.
just be debating on whether or not we should
Mm.
include economic powers
Yeah,
or to
yeah.
because what I hear a lot from the ANCAPs, and I still don't buy the argument.
Hmm.
It seems to suggest it just says, okay, so the corporations technically are a state concept in the fact that they need recognized before they're able to enter the stock market.
That's true,
Whereas
but
I w-
big
whereas I would
businesses can
argue,
exist. Yeah.
whereas I would argue that yes, that's true, but by that definition, no businesses exist in anarcho-capitalism. because all of them have to do that. Like they're not like
Uh,
what makes a corporation is the stock trading, and if you admit that can happen,
well, and like their legal
you have to
liability,
actively
corporations have a certain amount of legal liability that is disassociated from the individuals that control and own the corporation, right? Where you can like sue a corporation, but the owners of it aren't like personally liable. That kind of disconnection of legal liability would be absent in an anarchist world. In anarcho-capitalism, you wouldn't have that type of corporate legal personhood, but you could have big and small businesses, you could have labor unions, you could have worker co-ops, and all kinds of other constructed entities that represent a collective of people, right? So, but I know what you're saying about the
Well,
corporation
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
you just see a different form of it crop up, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that you still see the diffusion of liability. One of the reasons why you can't punish somebody when fucking Amazon breaks the rules, there's so many parts, what you can put them all in jail.
Right. Well,
Um,
you're not going to put all of Amazon in jail. But what if
exactly. Okay. Oh wait, you're all cutting
sorry.
out.
Sorry, man. Oh,
No
I thought you
problem.
were going to say something, so I
Oh
quieted
no,
down.
no, no. I was just waiting for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, I understand exactly what you say about Amazon. Like, what if Amazon goes and, ruthlessly enslaves some tribe in a third world country somewhere? It's not like the U.S. government is going to put Jeff Bezos in jail for that, right? He's not going to be held personally responsible for some atrocity that his company creates, even though it happened under his watch. Maybe, and, even if he says, oh, I had no personal knowledge of this atrocity, I would say that doesn't excuse him if it's, from moral culpability, because it is his company and it is his responsibility to have control over what that company does. Negligence
Yeah.
and being unaware of what the hell it is that you own is out there doing is not an excuse in terms of like criminal liability, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
yeah,
I think you'd
but
agree with
the
that,
one
right?
thing, yeah, I completely agree with that. But the entire idea is this is when this is the reason why law is not inherent. This is the reason why
Mm-hmm.
appealing to legality is a fallacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
The legal structure is supposed to be like this vague synopsis of what our morality is at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also the best way to quote unquote enforce that as much as it stretches the use of terms enforce
Mm-hmm.
is right because not a very effective way of kowtowing behavior. All it does is impose punishments, right?
Sure.
But basically, you the reason why you couldn't punish Bezos because it reasonably could be argued that people at the lower rungs were most responsible, and how much blame do you place on them, right? So there's just some like a lot of moving parts, and we'd
Yeah.
eventually just come from either we're punishing people really selectively here, or
Mm-hmm.
we're essentially arresting everyone because you can't really ascertain who did what and what did what, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How
All right,
would
so
in anarcho-syndicalism, since we're on this topic, I'm genuinely curious how you think it would play out. Let's say anarcho-syndicalism has been achieved, and there is a syndicate or a worker co-op or something of that nature that's doing something, and let's say it's got a couple hundred worker owners in it, and then maybe 10 of them in one little department of the worker co-op, they go out and commit some kind of atrocity or immoral act that deserves some sort of corrective action or punishment or whatever. Do I'm assuming you wouldn't hold the entire worker co-op responsible. Your system would make an attempt to single out those individuals that did the evil act, while letting the other people in that organization that had nothing to do with it, remain unpersecuted, right?
oh well, yeah, but the issue with that example
Mm,
becomes non-analogous
mm,
is there's not as many right. So like
mm-hmm.
the other thing is you have so many people in a corporation, you
Yeah,
need to arrest so many people, and some of them aren't even in your jurisdiction, right?
yeah,
Whereas where if you deal with like an not narco cap, a necro-syndicalist business, right? It
yeah,
wouldn't span miles and miles, so it'd be way easier to pin down who did what. And you
yeah,
probably, since systems aren't perfect, somebody's spending time in a corrective facility that doesn't need to be there at
yeah,
some point, right? It'd be
yeah.
foolish to pretend that would not happen.
Sure, we obviously we would want to minimize instances of that
Yeah,
happening,
yeah,
but
yeah,
nothing's ever perfect. There's always going to be a
yeah.
mistake made somewhere. So, but minimizing it would obviously be ideal.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
So basically, so let's talk. I think where the conversation would be most suited is where do you stand on those soft powers? Because that's remember when I was talking to you in DMs, I said that's probably where we're going to disagree a lot is on
Mm-hmm.
how coercive they can be.
Mm-hmm. Man, it's interesting, man, because I think that a lot of the people in the anarcho-capitalist camp, sorry, in the anarcho-communist camp, put the label of oppression, or aggression on a lot more things than I would label, as being oppressive or aggressive. It seems that the definite that label is applied much more enthusiastically by the ANCOMs. They'll say, well, if you're a single lone individual and you're trading with a big company, you're at a disadvantage just because you're smaller, and that's oppressive or that's unjust. And I don't think that's the case. In fact, I know a lot of instances where a single person has more power than a big company. Just in the business dealings that I've done, on an anecdotal level, of course, I've got relatives that are very highly skilled, where large companies fight each other to outbid each other. Like imagine like eBay, but for highly skilled employees, and the bids just go up and up and up. And all of a sudden, someone's getting offered like a 50% pay raise just to go work for this other company because they're so valuable. And it seems to me like in those situations, the individual, and what I'm trying to say here is that the size of a given entity, whether it's an individual, whether it's a company with just 5 people, or whether it's a corporation with, 50,000 employees, that can be an indicator of who has more power, but it's not always necessarily going to be that way. Sometimes the smaller entity can have more power because of some other factor, because of some skill or some property or some technology they developed or something like that. So and just because one entity has more power over another doesn't necessarily mean that whatever interaction they're going to choose to do is oppressive or unjust. When you have something like racketeering, where someone says, hey, you agree to my terms or I'm cutting you off completely from such and such, that's when you're getting into the world of threats and retribution. And if you don't agree with me, I'm going to punish you. That's like a mafia behavior, and that's different than just saying, look, if you don't offer me the pizza at the price I want to pay, then I'm not going to buy your pizza. I'm not oppressing you by refusing to buy your pizza, and the pizza company is not oppressing me by refusing to offer the pizza at the price I want it. Now, when you start threatening and cutting off and such, that's when you start getting into the oppressive and unjust and immoral behaviors. So soft power, I guess it depends. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your version of soft power includes the mafia-like tactics that I consider immoral, and it also includes the mere power differential involved in voluntary trades that I do not consider immoral. So I think it would be a case-by-case basis.
Okay, so when you were talking about size, I think that was a little bit of irrelevant to the point because
Okay.
I'm talking about power disparities regardless how they're ascertained.
Okay,
And
sure.
even then,
Yeah.
okay, so even if we want to argue that size is the thing, well, you're still offering one a standard that isn't meant by the other. Uh, you require the individual in that situation to exceed well beyond where they ought to be, right? So like you have like a reasonable way you can expect somebody to act, and so we're offering a different standard depending on how much collective power somebody has, and I think that's not very fair, right? We can and that would definitely start to undermine the aspects of the market, right? Because if you have these deals that are only ascertained because higher powers put their foot on the scale, right? Well, then you're not only going for the best products. Now I can leverage things that are extra market, right? To the same ends, when we talk about this Little Caesars example, again, having a choice between masters isn't necessarily a meaningful choice. It's a superficial choice. Also, you don't really with the 6 families staying. Actually, it's 5, right? After Fox sold out, right? So like these 5 families, technically, you're not really choosing someone else at some point because your subsidiary, right? There's so many inner backhand deals. It's really hard to keep up track of who what. So if I wanted to boycott a specific company, I couldn't at this point, right?
Sure.
You could argue that there is an illusion of choice, and ultimately I'll go into the wider system. But also, all of your examples were individual. When I'm talking about a wider system, for example, is I need to engage and work for someone like Amazon, like Little Caesars, to get money. And the reason
Mm-hmm.
why I do is because they control the resources. Now then we get into why that's a problem. Like if it was just a system where I received equal parts for my labor, if what I produce for them I got back, it wouldn't be that big an issue. Like we'd work and then I'd get what I want and
Yeah.
they'd get to use me for whatever service, right? Because if we owned it in kind, right?
Yeah, but
But the issue comes when if I don't work for any of them and I don't accept the fact that they're going to eat a little bit off a little bit is an understatement. They're going to eat a bunch off the top, right? If I don't accept that and I don't already have money, well, I can't start my own business, right? Because I don't have the capital, and no one's going to loan me if I don't got a job.
well,
So
I mean, a lot of people do make businesses out from scratch, even if they don't have a lot of capital. I've made a couple of small businesses from scratch. I know Jeff Bezos wasn't exactly broke, but when he made Amazon, but he did start Amazon
so
fairly
when you
recently, and he started it in a garage, just like Apple
could
Computers
we
started in a
go
garage. You know.
no could we go more point by point so we can talk about you now,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Okay.
Okay, so when you talk about small business from scratch, well, that's not really the same thing. Okay, so the reason why I don't think that's really the same thing is if by the fact that you said business is, we can assume
Yeah.
that you're safe in your finances, right? When you're doing this. Whereas you
Mm-hmm.
could argue that most of the money or a lot of the money that you invest is largely sourced from the business. You're obfuscated from a lot of the and a lot of the opportunity costs as well. Like if they needed money, you could draw from other sources. All
Mm-hmm.
right, so you have a lot more advantages at your hands than somebody that's like, "Oh my fucking god, I'm homeless. I live in a literal garage and I sell hot dogs out of it." Right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that business sort of needs to take off for you're out of the garage, aren't you?
Yeah, I suppose that's true. But yeah, and then that gets back to the whole question. It's like, some people are dealt a less advantageous hand of cards in the game of life, and just the fact that that is so doesn't necessarily give argument to the abolishing of private property rights altogether, just because some people don't have as much access to private property. Uh,
We keep going into these individual examples, and I don't think that's where we're going to find any of the reasonable conversation because we'd go all day. Because you
mm,
can say that some guy that was 5 foot had a cleft chin. He had a limp, and he was able to make billion bajillion dollars. Right? Well,
mm-hmm.
yeah, that's true. But I want something that's actionable for a larger group of people. So I think
I
we should
got
look at
you.
the system.
Sure.
Right? Right. So I think we should look at the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we look at the system and we look at economic powers, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
because if things were Minecraft, right, it wouldn't be a problem if somebody didn't want to sell me anything because I just go and punch trees and make my own shit, right? Well, but life isn't Minecraft. We have a finite number of homes. We have a finite number of amount of land, right? And
Yeah.
we have a finite ability. Like all that land is owned by someone or something,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's either by facto either state, public, or private property. So it's not like if I somehow managed to make the perfect income utopia out in the fucking woods somewhere. Well, what's gonna happen is Uncle Sam's gonna kick out the door with a rifle and he's gonna fucking murk me, right?
Maybe. But let's say that Uncle Sam was taken out of the equation somehow, in Ann Compton. I mean, le- like you did point out that it is true that some people just don't have as many access to resources, and therefore their choices can be somewhat limited. Maybe it's harder for them to start a business than it was for me, and maybe therefore working for Amazon, and agreeing to Amazon's employment terms is just the more logical choice for them to make. And then you lament the fact that that is the case, and you lament the fact that their choices are somewhat finite, and that their choices, even in a free market, might be more finite than the guy next door. And that may be the case, but then first of all, how does that mean that the market should be abolished altogether? How does how does that make how is that problem even solved in a planned economy or in an economy where the needs are all guaranteed?
Well,
You
that's
you
all
say that
because
housing should be guaranteed. What about startup capital for a new business? Should that also be guaranteed? You know.
startup capital. Well, there's ways in which that was
Mm.
theorized. So essentially, what would happen is if you went to a market socialist system,
Mhm.
Single, if it wasn't dead before, it's dead now. Single proprietor businesses, because it just wouldn't be
Mhm.
viable once you got a certain side, right? So
Yeah.
you just see a lot of co-joint investments. We're already seeing that, right?
Yeah.
Even the first companies were joint investments, right?
Sure.
So you're already gonna say no more single proprietors. And so then the next thing is you could talk about how we could have government buyback programs. Like, let's say if some by some stretch of the imagination we have a single proprietor because he's fucking batshit and
Mhm.
insane, right? And he gets to that point. What we can do is we can look at his investment of resources, how much money he invested, and give him like a 1 1/4 subsidization, like what you put in some, then some. Since he's getting some out of
Mhm.
it, he's not getting like left high and dry, right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, I don't think owning something gives you infinite access to everything produced. I think that's sort of coercive. So the reason why we get into getting rid of the private aspects
Mhm.
is so when we talk about private property, we're talking about the means to things, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about we live in a small society, right? And there's one river, right? Well, that one river,
Mhm.
if it's owned by one fucker in town, guess what? Guess who now is everyone's boss? Well, it's the guy that controls your mean to the food, right?
Yeah. That's
So
true. At least for the time being, until someone else figures out how to make another river, right? Which would be a highly incentivized thing. There would be
yeah,
a lot
but
of pressure to.
then you just be swapping rulers. So we've not actually fixed the fundamental
Mhm.
problem, which is most people are getting fucked over.
Hmm.
Now, where you could argue that is you can become the king. You can't argue everyone at the same time, or most people can become the. Does that make sense? So, whereas I'm not satisfied for individuals, I want
Mhm.
things that are maximizing happiness, right? I want things
Yeah.
that are better and most applicable for everyone.
Yeah.
I don't think just because you own the river, you should be allowed to bar people access from it, coerce people into this, right? Now, if we
Sure.
look at the way in which our economy is controlled, we have most of the economic soft power delegated to private actors, right?
Yeah.
And I think the issue with this is I'm forced into arrangements where I have to accept a worse lot, right? And so I think a
Hmm.
society in which we minimize the way somebody could do this, we could get into why that would be, because we can talk about how so we mentioned military power is a hard power.
Yeah.
Another hard power is political power because it's implicit that your political power translates directly to
That's right. The
hard
president
power,
can
right?
embargo an entire country with the stroke of a pen, right? Is that
Well,
what you're
yeah,
talking
yeah.
about? Political
It's
power?
implicit that your political power is going to lead in. Well, so you had to think about what is defined as a states, the monopoly enforced within a centralized model, right?
Yeah.
As defined, right? So implicit in political power is your ability to summon the police, summon the guards, right? Whatever they are,
Yeah.
whatever it be, whatever we call it, whatever uniform, right? So in political power, what happens is capitalists are able to go and say to like politicians, right? Even if we got rid of lobbying, this would we're allowed the politicians are allowed or like the capitalists, I'm sorry. The capitalists are allowed to go up to politicians and they're allowed to say, "Hey,
Yes.
you do this, you make these policies, and um,
I'll
I will
donate to your reelection campaign or
yeah,
something
yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'll give
Yeah.
you
It's
fast sums." And
regulatory
even if that
capture, right?
people praise Europe for getting money out of politics. Well, they didn't really do that. You know what they did? They kicked the can slightly down the road. What they do is now it's all party focused. So now loyalty is more to the party than the candidate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a party governed system than an individual candidate governed system, right? So they didn't really
Mm-hmm.
get rid of the system. They didn't. They just made it hard. You just abstracted it one level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and also we can talk about how even if they didn't have access to funding parties, we didn't have access to the government at all. They'd somehow worked all the money out of your political system. No more money in government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, at that point, we would still see them be able to put money into ads. We would still see them allowed able to buy news outcast broadcasts.
Yes.
We
That
can
happens all
right
the
so
time,
so
doesn't it?
so we can see all those things bleed over into the other powers.
Yeah.
So when we talk about economic power, we're not just talking about economic power. So one of the big things that comes to delegitimizing this, like billionaires wouldn't be a problem if it just they had things. Billionaires would be like zero problem. No problem at all. You can have a lot of things. Like I don't
Mm-hmm.
care.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is when they start to control the means to stuff and when they start to be able to bleed into other areas. And so essentially what you have is these people with insane amounts of power that have no ability to be checked. So we have a lot of unrevocable, unjustified, because the market itself is not inherently justified. I gave you an example of a market externality is when you have disparate actors dealing with each other. You're not dealing with what's the best product, you're dealing with what's best for the strongest actor, right? So in this way, the market's usurped. So that's justification of the meritocracy or the market justification sort of bleeds down as you concentrate power. Even
Mm-hmm.
Adam Smith admits that markets can't function in monopoly, right?
Sure.
So
But
they,
isn't it?
so
Are
you,
you getting real back to
so
that monopoly thing real quick though? Because you were talking about the river and so on. And do you see anarcho-syndicalism or anarcho-communism as having more decentralization and more choice and more competition than the anarcho-capitalist free market model? Is that?
well,
It seems like you're saying
well,
like the ANCAPs are going to be more monopolized and more centralized, but I think the opposite would be true. That a lot of ANCOMs tell me competition would be banned or at least severely restricted, and so on, and that everything would be done democratically, like in a big centralized vote, winner take all kind of thing, right?
the market would function hella differently. You'd still have
Yeah.
grinding parts, but you wouldn't form it solely on like who can best compete one thing, because one of the issues with the competition first market, and this is acknowledged the world over.
Mm-hmm.
You when okay, so the stock market's really good at maximizing efficiency. When we
Mm-hmm.
define efficiency as short-term profit gain. When
Yeah.
we define it that way, they're really fucking good at that, right? Well, the issue is if I want what is best in the short term, I'm going to eat a lot of long-term costs, right? For example,
Yeah.
the McDonald's. I was for frame of reference, I know about this because I did a honors project for, and they were doing research proposals, and somebody was doing
Mm-hmm.
um, workplace psychology, right?
Okay.
And one of the issues is McDonald's has like an insanely high turnover rate, and that's just like per se, right? Like it's not individual McDonald's, these are like all McDonald's. It
Hmm.
has like some like 91 disparity rate. It's some like insane number like that. And it makes sense, right? A lot of people get it for like a part-time job during the summer when they're going
Yeah.
to high school, right? No
Yeah.
one wants to work at McDonald's their entire life. Now,
Sure.
what this does is McDonald's eating a lot of training costs that will add up. So one of the ways they could get around this, if McDonald's was palatable enough to the point where I would say, "Oh God, I got a job at McDonald's. I can start a career now, right? I'm not
Yeah.
training in and out. I'm not operating at inefficiencies at any given time because some teenage girl decided that she broke her nail one time when she was wiping down the counters, and since it's just a school part-time job, they shouldn't give a fuck, right? Like you don't have to deal with a lot of these externalities that will eventually hike up that long-term cost and deal
Sure.
with like inefficiency and waste, right?
Sure. But, I think one of the reasons McDonald's has such a high turnover rate is because it's an entry level type of job most of the time, right? The training costs can be relatively high because as a consequence of that high turnover. But because it's an entry level job, it's a low skill job, and low skill jobs are easier to train for than a highly skilled job where you go to school for 10 years to become like, a brain surgeon or whatever, right?
Well, that's
So,
true, but that's what I was just talking about, one of the biggest corporations, and an
yeah.
issue they have specifically with the idea that when you leave it all up to these individual like these short-term costs, and
Hmm.
we can get into like how it ruins media. Like media is so bad now.
You mean like the
yeah,
mainstream media, right?
I'm not talking about like media as in like news media. I'm talking about like
Oh,
movies and
movies
like
and
shows
stuff.
are better now, but movies are shit, man. They're so bad. And the reason why they're so bad is because they
Yeah.
make it for demographics. So they're like, what does the chart say about this demographic? What are the kids like? They like fart jokes and right?
Yeah.
Like you get these really ill-informed people doing like really like unhuman judgments that's just designed to deal with the lowest common denominator
Yeah.
and we only have Marvel movies anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like one of the issues is it's hard to start. Like you could make a shit ton of money off a new IP, but if you bet on the wrong
But
course and
everyone just keeps rebooting everything, right? Instead of
yeah,
making new
you
IP.
get burned, right? And then boom, you do now. I can't make a choice. Now I have to sort of follow trends. So we can look at like comic book movies, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Comic book movies, like for the longest time, were like Marvel wanted to be DC, and the reason why Marvel wanted to be DC is because DC was gritty, gritty. DC was real. Batman was a cold, brooding protagonist, and that's why every Marvel movie at um during the early 2000s was like this
Yeah.
gritty sort of like they had Blade, they did the Punisher movie, right?
I never
Because they
saw
were trying to
Punisher.
be.
Blade was really good though. But
I think I saw it when I was younger. But
yeah.
anyway, so long story short, Marvel gets lucky in this engagement. They're like, okay, what was really popular before was camp, right? So let's go a
Mm-hmm.
little bit before that and like do like these semi lighthearted, moralistic pieces with a long flowing story, right? That's what Endgame is,
Mm-hmm.
right? Starting from 2006 all the way to 2020, we just did an ambitious product where everything built off each other, and so that's why the MCU is so good. And now I wouldn't have an issue with the MCU being so good, is if by issue of them being so good, everyone doesn't become them. Like there's like the Call of Duty effect, right?
Hmm.
The idea that
What's the
every
Call of Duty
so
effect?
so the Call of Duty effect was when you talk about first person shooters for the longest time,
Yeah.
everyone wanted to be Call of Duty. And what's because what they did, they
Uh
revolutionized the shooter genre.
yeah.
You didn't get these albeit they weren't sluggish, but they were like more tactical. And they what you did is you saw a lot of games do a lot of perk based systems like casual elements, right?
Yeah.
And what this ultimately does is it creates a sameness. And the reason why for the sameness is because there's not much incentive to reinvent the wheel when you'll get burned in the short term for that.
Hmm. Yeah,
Like
I
you,
see.
yeah. So
And that's kind of like that's like a manifestation of the concept of the short term,
yeah,
versus the long
because
term, huh?
because we could ultimately, if we just had a company that's able to just sit down and say, hey, maybe we're not going to get a movie or a game every year. Maybe we're not going to go and have something, but we're going to do something different. Like there are some game studios that do this, like Double Fine. Double Fine's an example of that, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
market heavily disincentivizes creativity within that market if you get into the higher ends, because then you start to see shovelware. An Ubisoft game has the same formula every single time.
Mm-hmm.
You have your main plot, you have your side quest, you have your 4 to 5 to 6 side quests, and you have whatever crafting mini games there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so this analogy is getting a little bit away from me, but basically the idea is we can see products degrade when we prioritize short-term value
Mm.
in media. So that's one of the ways in which capitalism has issues. Is it so for risk of sounding like an asshole? Capitalism kills culture.
Hmm. Uh, I don't disagree with you about the short term versus long term in principle. I actually like the way you described it, and I like the analogy with the video games. I'm a avid gamer myself, and I totally know what you're talking about there. But you're when you blame the market for that, I mean, I think honestly, like a lot of consumers wanted a lot of that sameness. Like Madden. The Madden video game franchise is almost the same every year. It comes out with a new version like Madden 16, Madden 17, and so on. But people just eat that shit up and they buy it so much and they love it and they play the hell out of it. They play a lot of hours on it. And these
Oh,
first
wait,
person
you brought
shooters,
Madden.
people play
Okay.
a lot of hours on these first person shooters that are all very similar. I've played some Call of Duty and I'm a big Halo fan myself, and a lot of the Halo games are very similar, but they're still a lot of fun. And this is just what the consumers are rewarding the producers for producing those things. But that doesn't mean that there's not room for innovation, perhaps on a smaller scale. Maybe while the masses are eating the slop, there's some more savvy connoisseurs that are eating the caviar, so to speak, right? The proverbial caviar. And a free market makes allowances for both. I mean, the only solution I see to the problem that you describe, and I can agree that maybe it is a problem, but the only solution I see for that is to prevent the consumers from getting what they want, because they're the ones that are choosing to consume these things, right? So you would have to put some kind of artificial restriction on what is produced, or put some kind of artificial restriction on what consumers are allowed to consume, just to reshape an industry so that it's producing the kind of entertainment and media that you see fit. You would have some sort of censor bureau or something like that.
No, of course not. Okay, so we'll
Mm-hmm.
start at first. You brought up Madden. That's a very bad example for you. You know why?
Why? Actually, I don't never play Madden. I just know that it comes out
No, no,
every
no.
year with
The
some minor
reason why I said
changes.
that's a very bad example for you
Why?
is when you talk about how they'll continue to buy the same Madden. Well,
Yeah.
there's a reason for that, dog. The reason why they're allowed to stagnate, the monopoly they have.
Madden has
There's
a
a monopoly on
monopoly.
yeah, they have a monopoly on the rights to make NFL games. They're the only ones. They bought it out of a 2K. Right. So that's a very bad example for you, because that means that I can talk about the way in which backhands deals.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Epic Games Store, right?
Okay.
The
Well,
Epic Games Store. Oh,
yeah.
you can go.
I like how you're pointing out that it's a bad example for me, but I think it's a good example in the sense that, well, what you're doing is you're educating me on the fact that Madden, they have a monopoly, they have a license from the NFL to create this game, and that's right there is an example of intellectual property rules or laws ruining the consumer experience. And as an anarcho-capitalist, I
Well, yeah,
oppose
but I'd
intellectual
also
property
wait.
laws, right? Any game studio should be able to go and make a football game that uses that uses players in it, without getting arrested for it, right?
Well, the big thing is the issue is the likeness, right? So one of the
Mm-hmm.
reasons why this is even a thing is, so basically what would happen
Mm-hmm.
is, let's say we're trying to propose a model in which everyone has free access. That deal's gone now, right?
Yeah.
Well, you're still going to end up having a deal where you have to be strong enough to deal with NFL, because what you're essentially doing is those players have collective bargaining rights, right? For
Mm-hmm.
their like, and so they get paid some monies in royalties from the NFL, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever amount that be. So there's no way in which you'd see those players forfeit their collective bargaining rights, right? So,
Hmm.
um, let's go back to the how would we solve this problem? Well, we solve this problem. One, we could have subsidies of the market, right? So what we could do is we could say,
Hmm.
okay, we want to enrich culture.
Yeah.
Let's give companies the money they can do so they can go out and take risks. So if somebody has an innovative IP, we could fund the culture arcs. We don't really need to do that, because one of the reasons why they're able to do this shovelware is so let's talk about how this is a big issue on console. You know why it's big issue on console, especially
Yeah.
maybe a little bit less recently. Well, it's more of an issue on console because
Yeah.
who else are you gonna fucking buy from? That's what everyone does on console. All right. So
Hmm.
there's the idea of, if you don't have the right platform, you can't really find too many gems like Stardew Valley, right? That's the game I've been playing a lot, right? And it's very creative, and it's an
Hmm.
indie project
Hmm.
for whatever.
Well,
I haven't looked too much
when
into
you
the.
talked about a subsidy, you said maybe we could subsidize increased creativity and increased innovation, right? Now, it's true right now that startups and companies that want to raise capital
If you
to
if
do
you
something
wouldn't
innovative.
mind, so since you did the point by point, I don't want to
Oh,
leave a bunch of points on the table, right? So like you
okay.
did some points, so I want to address them, and then we can go point by point from
Sure,
there.
sure. Okay.
And then we could do that from now on, because I think that's a better way of doing it, definitely. But what would happen is, what you got to make a bunch of points, and then we're going to get caught on one I was making, right?
Okay, sorry
Is
about that.
so
I didn't
that
mean
oh
to.
yeah, that's completely fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we were talking, and you were talking about how. So I don't even think we need to do the subsidies, right? What
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to do is we need to just get in there, and we can acknowledge that they're in bed with each other, right? And they are. I don't know exactly how, but there's a lot of commingling at the top. It would be, you'd be a fool to assume they're all interlocking and competing actors, right?
Yeah.
There's this collective interest. So what we do is we break down those companies into smaller companies, similar to what happened to Microsoft in the early 2000s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we just would need to see the spreading of power, and that way we don't see these shovelware companies just dictating the market on the force of what you think of video game, you think Call of Duty or something like that, right? Um, that's just fine. But now Treyarch has so much power that they dictate whatever is allowed, and you're essentially fighting a titan with a different with a weapon you've never used before. If you step up to them, so we just need to take away a lot of the power concentration in the market,
Hmm.
and we might have to see some amount of like if we're talking about like a short term solution, well, we just see the we would have to see a way in which those companies like die. Like we'd have to see a 1980s video game crash again,
When
right?
ET got released and then they put it in a landfill because it sucks so bad.
Well, I mean, like that's what they did with No Man's Sky. I heard.
No Man's Sky ended up being like a redemption story, right? Because it started out as sucking, but then development continued, and eventually the game got good and started living up to the hype that it initially failed to meet.
Well, I
But
think the big issue they were having, it wasn't necessarily the lack of hype. There was direct promises made from the guy, and so he's really lucky that he was able to get a chance to redeem himself because he essentially lied. He said there'd be
mm,
multiplayer.
mm,
It's tagged over with a sticker
yeah,
on the box, right? Yeah, so there's a lot of like, and
it's
it's
an
also like
epic story, man.
it's apparently like insanely like it was like insanely poorly optimized. Like people
mm.
with like beastly machines. Like if you alt tabbed, you were afraid it was gonna crash.
Yeah, on a
Right?
beastly
Like
machine. Yeah,
it's like 2007, right?
yeah,
Anyway, the big thing with all of that is right. Yeah, I know. So I think you just gotta just spread some of the power around. We could see a market subsidies. We just had to find a way to bolster at those at the bottom. And I'm not saying it's like doomed. I'm not saying like I'm not like a hipster. I'm like the best games were made 14 years ago. Bring back old Valve.
yeah. Yeah, speaking of the what you were just talking about is the shovelware, and these companies get too big and they refuse to innovate. Uh, I definitely see that. I'm not disagreeing with it, but like I've got a Steam account, and I've seen. I'm old enough to remember back like the NES 8-bit days, and it seems to me that there's a lot more small time indie developers, and there's a lot more unique game content available out there on the market. Even if most people are gravitating towards the shovelware and just playing Call of Duty all day, I personally see a
Oh, that's
larger
why.
variety of different unusual new kinds of games to play that I've never done, that I've never used before. And it seems to me like my choices have increased over time from more game developers rather than the opposite, despite the fact that these big companies are behemoths and pumping out shovelware. You're right about that, but simultaneously there's choices in the smaller areas as well, right, with the
Well, yeah,
smaller
yeah,
developers.
yeah. That's why I was making the point that
Mm,
if we look at console, you sort of
yeah,
have a choice between shovelware. It's getting better, but
yeah,
it's because those like the reason why you're buying a console because one, you don't want to fucking optimize shit, right? You want
hmm,
cheap and you want it to work no matter what game you're playing.
that's right.
And so they have to
Yeah,
heavily select for what will work.
yeah.
And so they were like really skeptical to put their name on these I don't think it's so much of an issue anymore, but there's these string of like survival GoFundMe's, right? These upstarts.
Yeah,
It was public testing or beta, right?
yeah.
Right. There was a string of that. And they were like really skeptical to put their name on like Arc, right? It's like because Arc doesn't work a lot of the times because it's really
Mm-hmm,
unoptimized. And if you play it on console, it plays like shit, right?
mm-hmm.
Yeah, so one of the issues is when you start to we're controlling for platform now because in PC, yes, you can, but that's also because of the fact that you just have you have the benefit of the PC just being that much stronger. It can
Yeah,
run things if you
yeah,
have a good PC. Console has limitations. You need to optimize it for console,
yeah,
and yeah, it would depend on the market, especially, but just specifically the idea that when you talk about because is what's essentially happening is like only like I don't even know how many companies, but probably like five. I don't know how many like game companies there are. They're probably sub developers and all that, right? But
mm-hmm,
they all work with these big companies to make console games,
mm-hmm,
right?
I mean, one good example I think is Minecraft. It started out as like an indie development, and then eventually got sold to Microsoft for billions. You know, they went from little guy to big guy, and then Minecraft ended up being multi-platform. Right? You can get it on your phone, I think, even if you want, and you can put it, of course, on your PC or any console.
I'm pretty sure before they got bought up for merging, the phone was. I think you can put some of the innovation of Minecraft on the fact they were owned by Mojang, but that's also sort of like
Yeah,
the inertia of the time, right? We
yeah,
we, we live in a very cross-platform environment now.
yeah.
It's easier to make one set OS, like operating system, or maybe make it for console first and then go to PC, right? It's easier to do that for a game and then say, well, eventually everyone's going to come to play the same game.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, so it just depends on the IP. Like you couldn't, the issue with making FPSs cross-platform is, well, the people with the controllers and the bones are going to get fucked up. Right.
in imagine imagine multiple game console choices in an anarcho-communist economy, and people, let's say, you know, maybe there's like the proverbial Xbox and the equivalent of the PlayStation and so on. Would the manufacturers of those consoles in anarcho-communism get compensated in proportion to the number of units that get moved off the shelf, or would they have some sort of income guarantee regardless of which system ends up proving more popular among consumers?
Well, it would depend. What would probably happen is, given the fact that those are owned directly by the workers, you might
Mm-hmm.
see what would be like the IWW of video games,
Mm-hmm.
where they just decide like, hey, and also the need the in, like if you're separating the communes, what
Mm-hmm.
would probably be is you probably have a multilateral between all the different communes and unions, right?
Yeah.
And they probably could agree on one console. You don't need an Xbox. You don't need an Xbox One. You don't need a PS4
Mm-hmm.
when you can just make one console. And
Mm-hmm.
then uh,
If
there's a bunch of different ways that could pan out.
Yeah.
But if one started to fail, I'm not sure how that, because what you'd probably do is
I
you'd
mean,
probably
would
just
there?
see.
What I'm trying to say is, would there be risk? Would someone be at the risk of losing it all, so to speak? You know, like that's kind of happened. I mean, there's been failed consoles released in, you know, capitalism, right? I think the Atari Jaguar or something like that, and then Atari ended up, you know, becoming a shell of what it once was and just got out of the console market entirely because it had a failed console and they just lost a lot of money. And I mean, would that kind of loss be possible or permissible, or would be people protected from the beds, from sleeping in the beds they made if they made a bad bed in anarcho
Now,
communism?
whereas I am not completely against businesses failing, right? It
Mm-hmm.
within the luxury market, right? Because there's less risk. Those people aren't going to go home and kill themselves because they might not be able to form their home anymore, right? Right. But whereas I would come to the idea is it just depend on how it affects the market. Since
Yeah.
I'm a consequentialist, I'm not really into these broad prescriptions. It all depends on what is the best modus of motive operandus to um
Mm-hmm.
to maximize
Hmm.
happiness, right?
Yeah.
And so to that ends, we probably just play it by ear, and the rule would be whatever is best for the market.
Yeah.
Like we wouldn't if there was just two consoles, it wouldn't be prudent for us to allow there just to be one console on the market and let them like operate with a monopoly
Yeah.
within this specific thing.
Yeah.
Right, because you just see, you could also have, given the fact that the industries are separated by like the unions and like, and it's also spread across multiple municipalities, right? You can see sanctions work a lot better here because you
Mm-hmm.
don't have you don't, there's no possible autarky, right? There,
Mm-hmm.
what you see is what you get,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's harder to form layers of protection from the international community.
Yeah.
And so what would probably happen is to avoid punishments or embargoes, you just see them willfully agree to break down and stuff. Well,
Hmm.
and there's routes around that. You're not just relying on goodwill, right? You're just,
Hmm.
well, it's sort of like waving a stick and saying you know better.
Hmm. I got you. So here's a scenario for you. If there's like a couple of video game unions in anarcho-communism, and they're happily churning out consoles and software that people are happy to play, and then a new producer arises, a ragtag group of electrical engineers starts assembling circuit boards and console cases, and then they start producing, a third console. Let's say there were two before, now this third one is becoming an upstart. Do you think that it's possible? And if it's possible, do you think it would be like morally okay for those existing entrenched software unions or console unions to use soft power to try and stop this third competitor from arising and becoming like and gobbling up market share?
I'm not really sure where you'd put the line of that, because of course you want
Hmm.
them competing so they're not working together and driving up the price.
I mean, it's true that
But
capitalist companies, entrenched capitalist companies, do try and use power to stop startups and new competitors from arising,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
sometimes they
That's what I'm
succeed
saying.
and sometimes they fail.
Yeah, and so I'd imagine I'm not really on when you put the competition versus cooperation, I'm not sure where I'm sold on that. But
Hmm.
what I'd imagine would happen is certain practices that seen now would be like banned, such as like one of the big ways they edge out a smaller. Well, yeah, we well in supposedly in narco-capitalism, we actually get into that because I want to talk about that next.
Yeah.
Supposedly in narco-capitalism, they also have one of the biggest ways you edge out tech competitors. You start to so Microsoft did
Internet
it
browser.
was it was adopt, innovate, exterminate. It was like EEE, something like that. So essentially, what they
Yeah.
do is they would it's like imagine if you started offering something new. What they do is they'd use everything in their power to give something like it, and then they would
Hmm.
innovate, change it, tweak it slightly, and then use their sheer ubiquity to like push that person out. And that's done on the back of like
Yep.
back party deals and intellectual property, right?
Microsoft has done that a lot. Sometimes it succeeded and sometimes it failed. Two examples I can think it failed was the Windows Phone and Mixer, which was the competitor to Twitch.
Oh
But
no, Mixer's gone.
yeah, Mixer's gone. It failed. Microsoft bought it and then they shut it down because they said we can't do it. They tried to do the exterminate thing. They wanted to, rise up and compete with Twitch, and they failed. They also used the Windows Phone to rise up and compete with the iPhone and the Android phone,
Oh,
and they
that's
failed.
actually that's
Mm-hmm.
another interesting topic. The way this topic could swing.
Mm-hmm.
In the way the internet works, you can't really ensure out competition. Why the fuck am I going to somewhere that's not Facebook to do Facebook, right?
Yeah,
Right,
but
right.
Facebook competitors exist. Of course, they're very small and have a fraction of the user base that Facebook has, because when it comes to social media, people want to go where all the people are, right? I'm attracted to the place with the most people, and that's all.
Yeah, yeah. So then there's the idea of like should like given the fact that the market literally collapses in on itself because you don't need that would be the same thing as like a local monopoly, right?
Yeah,
Is well, if I have an ASP, I'm not gonna be able to shop around because right. So there's a bunch
yeah.
of so that externality exists inherent. So we get onto that topic. But anyway, with
Mm.
the whole thing with so wait, I forgot what the point before that was.
Oh,
Oh, you
we were talking about Microsoft exterminating and innovating,
Oh
and
yeah,
then
yeah,
I
yeah. It's
used
failed,
examples
but
of
Twitch was
where they
already a
failed.
really strong competitor by the time they stepped into the plate, and that comes down to the
Mm-hmm.
way the internet works. I think in a different reality, buying up the big name stars of
Mm-hmm.
those might have worked, but the way the internet works, the way the dice rolled out, they essentially wanted to go into an entrenched market
Yeah.
and fight with brute force to get in. We can talk. Yeah, yeah. So whereas this strategy can fail, but it usually only fails when the guy that they're trying to beat up lifted some weights beforehand, right? They can't just edge
Yeah.
out, right? They're not
Yeah.
that strong. But
Yeah.
this is also the idea of okay, so let's imagine we have a gun, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really into target practice but I also love my targets being slightly above people's shoulders. And I'm taking pop shots above your shoulder. And you're like, "Hey, could you stop? Could you stop fucking shooting above my shoulder for a second, dog?"
Yeah.
And then he'd say, right, "Well, I've not shot you yet."
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So the idea that you're able to do it would still be an issue, right? I still don't want somebody, even if it even never hits me, I don't want somebody firing above my shoulder.
That's right. You don't want to be put at that risk. You don't like having that potentiality so close, I
Exactly.
suppose. Right? Yeah.
So just because it can fail, like I don't want somebody. Just because you can succeed at shooting over my shoulder doesn't mean I want somebody shooting over my shoulder. So
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
the ability to wield that power, even if you choose not to, there is like the old adage about power. The best way to preserve power is actually not to use it. The reason why, because
Yeah.
people will forget you have it.
Hmm. Yeah.
This
That's a good
happened with the
point.
Supreme Court. So funny thing, the big court case that established judicial review, right? Pledge,
Mm,
not
what,
not Pledge versus Ferguson. It's
I'd like to think I
fucking.
know, but I'm not sure what you're referencing. Yeah.
All right. So the very first, when we first tapped the judicial bench, uh, the founders were so vague. Everyone was like, they got to the Supreme Court and like, what the fuck are you supposed to do? I guess I'll just
Mm,
elect you to the thing, right? And they
yeah.
just sit there, and then they come to a dispute in which it is determined that the Supreme Court has the power to review the constitutionality of the laws if they interpret the laws, and that it's reasonable that they interpret the Constitution, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he said, "We have this power, but we're not going to use it." And so he got to sit on it, and then it came later with O'Dagan. When they exercised it again, what happened is like the statute ran out. Like so, essentially, if you've made a bunch of decisions on top of this one thing, it becomes so entrenched you can't get rid of it, or your system is essentially illegitimate, right? So like imagine we say, okay, 18 isn't a proper age for consent because people's brains aren't developed. And it needs to be raised up to
25.
20, right? 25, 21, right?
Yeah.
Whatever you want to say, right? Well, what I can then argue is that any contract dealt with somebody under 25 is inherently illegitimate.
Mm,
And so we have a lot of people making wealth off of the backs of what is essentially rape, right? The
mm-hmm.
domination of one against the other. And so this would just tear apart the system. Like you have grounds of revolution right there. Like they allowed
Yeah.
people to exploit people who couldn't consent for so long. And then by that definition, we have retroactive pedophiles, right?
Yeah.
And it get yucky. So even if we did agree as a society in America that 25 is probably the age to go, we open the doors for the delegitimization of everything.
Mm.
So the statutes are well gone
I
after
gotcha.
that.
Yeah, like where they get entrenched and everything gets built on that as a foundation, and
Yeah,
then when you
yeah,
undermine that foundation, everything comes crashing down, right? Yeah.
it comes to a point where it becomes so important to the system. It's the reason why you can't
Yeah.
really, even if we wanted to get rid of social programs, we couldn't. They're everything's already running on fumes in the government.
Imagine just
So
stopping Social Security tomorrow. What would happen in America?
oh, you'd have revolts.
Yeah,
You
you'd
literally
have
have
riots everywhere.
yeah, yeah. You couldn't because
Storming
you'd
the
leave a lot of
palace.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So one of the things we can get into now is ISP under anarcho-capitalism.
Internet service providers? You mean
No, not ISP. I'm
ISP?
sorry. Intellectual property.
Oh, IP. Yeah, intellectual
Right, the
property.
IP. Okay. So how are you going to deal with medical research? For example, um, you sort of need that intellectual property because what happens is, let's say I make aspirin and I'm really happy about it, and I'm like, hey, I got this
Mm-hmm.
aspirin here, but it cost me millions of fucking dollars. So I don't really want some fucker who wasn't involved in R&D to come in and fuck with my aspirin right quite
Yeah,
yet,
right.
right?
The
I
question
should
is like, if I'm a drug manufacturer, why am I going to bother researching and putting the expense in making a new drug
exactly.
if I can't profit from it, right?
Well, yeah, it's not even just
Yeah.
that. It's not just I'm not profiting. It's the fact that all I'm doing is opening the door for some generic brand, right? To come fuck up everything. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
not gonna research at that point. Fuck you. I
Mm-hmm.
guess we'll just
Mm-hmm.
innovate on the same product,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
So we
yeah.
so
It's
how would you deal with that?
how would I deal with that? Well, I think I've got a good answer for you. Hear me out here. It just so happens that I worked for about 15 years in the healthcare industry, and While I did not work in the pharmaceutical industry, I know a little bit about like medical innovation, and the same is true for people that for companies that make prosthetics or whatever, people that are researching 3D printing kidneys or whatever, and the same goes true for the drugs, right? So these American companies are making these innovative drugs that are very expensive to research and produce and very expensive to get through FDA approval, and then the FDA says, okay, as a reward for all the expense that you endured, we're going to give you a monopoly on the production and distribution and sale of this drug, and as you have that monopoly, you can jack up the price and consumers have no choice but to pay it, right? And then the FDA bans generics, at least for a while. They'll say like, oh, you've got 5 or 10 years or whatever before we let competing companies bring in generics and stuff. So the thing is that what the FDA is doing, at least in this specific case, is that the FDA is trying to they're trying to give an incentive for a company to endure the costs that the FDA itself forces upon them before it lets them bring the drug to the market. Now, it is true that any drug is going to require a certain amount of expense to research and produce, but you know what? Electric cars and solar panels and rocket ships, reusable rocket ships, those also took a lot of research and expense to learn how to do those as well. This isn't a phenomenon that's unique to pharmaceuticals. It's prevalent in pharmaceuticals, but what the FDA does is the FDA exponentially increases the cost of research and development, and the FDA serves as a barrier to entry into the market, and that barrier to hurdle over that barrier is very expensive, much more expensive than it would be if the FDA did not exist and that the market was free. Why can't I buy cancer drugs on eBay right now from 100 different sellers, right? Because the FDA throttles and creates, it throttles those drugs, it throttles the production and distribution of them and creates an artificial scarcity, and by creating that monopoly, you get these drugs that are all super expensive. All it really does is there's only two parties that it helps. It helps the FDA and it helps the drug monopoly, right? Now, there's no monopoly. There's no monopoly on reusable rockets right now. There's no, like NASA exists and the government will do licensing and give permits for rocket ship companies, but it did not give SpaceX a monopoly on reusable rockets, and those things were very expensive to figure out how to make. And we don't necessarily need monopolies on drugs to justify the expense of the research and development. It's quite possible that you can have research and development of drugs and still have generics and still have competitors and things like that. The research of the silicon chip and making vacuum tubes obsolete. There's all kinds of examples where there's not a monopoly on making chips. There's all kinds of chip makers.
We can go into this specifically. So let's talk about.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is the principle applies the same for reusable rockets and silicon chips, just as it does for drugs. So
not the same way.
Okay, well, let me hear your thoughts.
So let's talk about the rocket example. Well, that's not analogous at all. Actually, it is. It's completely analogous. In the sense that we are talking about the government putting its hand into the market and stepping on the scale, right? Pushing down, right? You realize that markets, we fund rocket research through government contracts, right? So what that means is
SpaceX. I don't think, I could be wrong on this, but honestly, I do not believe that SpaceX got government money for the research of the reusable rocket. This was something that Elon and his team kind of came up with on their own, and they were using money from commercial satellite launches to fund that research. Now, it is true that SpaceX does get government contracts to perform certain launches for NASA and things like that, but that's just not research money. That's money for providing a rocket launching service. And the development of the reusable rocket was something that SpaceX did of their own initiative, with private capital and private investors and so on.
Well, aren't they eventually just going to sell to the? Who's going to be able to afford a fucking rocket?
Well, the cool thing about the reusable rockets is that it makes rocket launches cheaper, and it makes putting things into orbit more accessible for more companies. Now it's easier for people to buy a launch into space. Previously, they had to use the Russian or the European or the NASA rockets, and those were a lot more expensive because they were one-time use rockets. You couldn't reuse the rocket, and that, of course, increases your expense a lot. It's a lot more expensive to drive a car to the supermarket if you have to build a new car for every trip.
I found an article. This is way back. February 21st. So we get a little brown. Is SpaceX is looking to fund money in its new NBC's in funding, according to the report from NBC's Michael Sheets. The additional money would bring their total buy-in 36 billion. Yeah, you're not really leaving too many doors for competition there, right? According to CNBC. Oh my god, I hate all these acronyms. And it increased to then 2.5 billion versus its most recently reported valuation.
Yeah.
The rocket company funded by Elon Musk is no stranger to large sum of money. It added 1.3 billion during 2019. Anyway, so this part's irrelevant. So SpaceX is generating a significant revenue. Its contract to develop the Crew Dragon spacecraft as part of the NASA Commercial Crew Program.
Yep.
So they do receive monies from the government.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no. So it's the only way it's the only way you could do this. It's the only way you justify that because you're going to sell to them, and so they want that done, right? So yeah, no. So there's definitely government involvement. And let's talk about the other example you gave. Well, with the thing with rockets, right? We just see the government's helping foot the bill with its contract to commission it because there's no ubiquity. You're not going to like, yes, get your own space rocket, go to Mars tomorrow, right? You're not seeing consumer sale of that. It doesn't make sense. You couldn't do it, right? So they're given the lack of ubiquity. You need the market wouldn't allow for that otherwise, right? But in the example of computer chips, well, that's a ubiquitous product, right? And I also know that there definitely are patents, certain technology.
There's patents on certain type of circuitry, on certain types of circuitries, but the silicone chip was never like some sort of monopoly that was granted by a government to only one, chip manufacturer. The silicon chip itself as a concept has, I think, since the invention of the silicon chip, very quickly became, something that was made by multiple companies, Texas Instruments and AMD and Intel and all these other companies. And there's a lot of chip manufacturers nowadays, despite the fact that certain type of chip designs might be patented. The concept itself is something that.
Then you could just argue that drugs are not really ever restricted, only the individual designs, right? So then we could split hairs there, but you could also see that as a success of the vetting process of what is allowed to be made a patent, right? At that point, something so ubiquitous can't be monopolized in that way. Now, the reason why I think that medicine stands at a cross section here, you need all of those regulations on those medicines. You need to make sure they're working. You need to make sure that they pass inspection because companies can and they will fuck over the end consumer if it's prudent for the profit motive. This isn't because they're like evil people who eat like children for breakfast. They aren't like eating fetuses in the side, right? No. They're just responding to individual interest, and they might not even know some of the effects. So there needs to be a standardized way in an enforcement of that, just for societal good. Like you can't be allowed to poison people. And
I hear you there. I understand that concern, but I would say that consumer choice and competition should be sufficient. And when it comes to quality assurance, you can have quality assurance provided and verification of the quality of a product and the accuracy of the product description done by an independent third party that is not a government. It could be a private entity. It could be a worker co-op that specializes in certifying the safety of drugs. and it could be a for-profit worker co-op, and there could be multiple different worker co-ops that have their own
Well, even if,
specializations of the way that they certify the safety of these drugs. And then as a consumer, you could say, okay, that one company tested the drug the same way that we have car review magazines. You know what I mean? Like they'll tell you what cars suck and what cars are good, and you could tell you, so the same case I think is true for drugs. I don't think that the drugs. It seems tempting to say that drugs are a unique exemption, here, but I don't think that it's
well, I don't think just that. I'm just saying the way in which, okay, so for example, if you produce a shitty computer, that as long as it didn't blow up, you're not killing anyone,
yeah,
right?
it's not going to give you cancer, right?
Yeah, you're not dying from that. But if I take bad medicine, I'm getting really sick, and that's a lot of like just so when you
Uh-huh.
talk about consumables, things that people need to live, to eat, they need to eat and consume to live. I think it's well justified. And even if it was a worker co-ops aren't like immune to like corruption, right?
Yeah.
Because when you start delegating to these to third parties,
Mm.
what we're doing is we're saying, okay, so we got this third party. Well, now we need something that's checking that third party, and now we need something that's checking that third party, right? So eventually, this would come back and we'd unravel, and we just formed a
Yeah.
state.
Then who's checking the FDA, right? The state is not immune from that
Well, yeah, the
infinite
state audits
regress.
itself with other things, and so that this opens up issues, right? But none so glaring as some people blatantly acting in profit motive.
Hmm.
Like it, like whereas there is corruption at the government level, this is undoubtable,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
This is better able to be tracked, and this I'd argue that checking these organizations needs either other government institutions, or you need
Hmm.
to basically what you're doing is you're conscripting a bunch of actors into this, because we
Hmm.
need people doing this for ANCAP society.
Hmm.
So we must imagine a route to which we have to make this compulsory, right? Because we can't
Hmm.
allow there to be. So this is the reason why we come to tax being compulsory, right?
Hmm.
So the state needs to. So there's two prerequisites, basic bitch prerequisites, right? You need the monopoly of force, and you need the ability to level taxes. So you need to be able to control a territory, and you need to sustain yourself within the territory, right?
Yeah.
And so what this means is we reason that no one would voluntarily pay taxes. And that's true on a large scale. I don't think it's reasonable to say, well, yeah, you just get these businesses that would donate billions of dollars. The only reason they don't like it is because it violates their personal freedom, and their morality means so much, right? No, they
Hmm.
don't give a fuck. Right. So I would argue that in a situation in which you need this body and there's no way to remove benefits, right?
Hmm.
Everyone's going to benefit from the implicit protection police uh, provide, right?
Hmm.
So to this ends, uh, this is why you need taxes to be compulsory. Like I remember I heard somebody. I think this actually is the YouTuber Destiny. He gave this example. Imagine we have a Minecraft village, right?
Yeah.
And everyone in the village wants to get an iron golem, right, to protect their houses.
Yeah.
Well, there's no way to make sure villager A doesn't benefit from the iron golem when you get the iron golem, right?
Hmm.
So this means everyone has to do it, or you don't get the iron golem.
Yeah.
Because you don't want that person free riding. You don't want those people freeloading off you,
You don't
and
want
you need
someone
everyone.
free riding. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, exactly.
absent the ability to give the iron golem if you don't have the ability to make the iron golem only protect the houses that subscribe to your protection service, then yes, in that case you would need to have a compulsory tax on every house, no
Well,
exceptions,
this
right?
is why
No,
it's
but
implicit.
private protection companies do exist where security guards only patrol certain areas where subscribers pay in, and then they do not patrol the areas where the subscribers don't pay in. So decentralizing it and compartmentalizing a certain service so that only certain ones get it. In most cases, you can do something like that. I do understand that based on like geography and just pure logistics and where certain things are, sometimes you might need some sort of service that everyone has to pay into because otherwise the service won't work at all. But even the Iron Golem thing, it's like when ANCAPs talk about rooftop Koreans or the Mick police, right? there's a way to give at least a protection service on an exclusionary, opt-in basis.
Yeah, but we'd either accept that we have less able police forces, and then therefore your idea that the market inherently creates best product does fly in the face a little bit. Or we would accept that we are inevitably controlling for people in the vicinity as well, right? Because we're releasing these Pinkerton patrol groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the police did start as a private entity, and that
Mm-hmm.
worked out horribly, by the way.
Hmm.
So the police started as a private entity. They were called the Pinkertons, and so we have these patrolling Pinkertons. Well, not everyone on that block is going to pay for the Pinkertons to patrol that area, and so implicitly
Yeah.
they're receiving protections. There's no way you could say an effective police force would see a thug breaking into a house with a fucking crowbar and not reason to keep everyone else safe. They have to deal with it, right? Because
Sure, you
because
catch them in the act like that, and you're gonna take corrective action, whether or not the victim is a subscriber of your service. I could see that happening. Sure.
yeah. So that would have to, or you again you'd accept that the quality is intentionally being degraded, and then we come to the issue that that's a market externality. We're not providing the best police source. Maybe we should look into the options where that we agree that we as society in Anarcho-Capitalist are like, hey, well, Bobby got fucking killed last night. Some fucker broke in and killed him, and he couldn't afford the police.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now that fucker knows how to break into houses and kill people. We didn't stop him then. We don't have any evidence because we decided not to invest in that. Maybe we as a society need to say, like, we as a community be like, okay, everyone has to like pay the $50 or you can't live here anymore, right?
Yeah, and then all of a sudden, now you've got a tax, and now you've got a government, huh? In
Well, yeah.
Ancapistan.
So we'd eventually. Well, that's one of the issues that I have with Ancapistan as defined by no government. You need some. We've never existed about it. The idea that there was cavemen running around, that didn't really happen. We in Neolithic era we had like chieftains, right? We had like
sure.
tribes,
There was
right? So we've never
chieftains and
existed without
princes,
a government.
yeah,
And we eventually start to reason that there's certain common sense government. And now, whereas I would oppose that being called a state, like there's like the gotcha, like now you just agreed to a state. Now we're gonna go all the way back to neoliberal capitalism, and you're gonna have to worship nationalism like I do. No, I don't think that necessarily defeats the concept, but the idea that this can be a complete absence of coercive authority, I think flies in the face of pragmatism because and this is the reason why I mentioned that the only way to get rid of all hierarchy, and this is all hierarchies in general, right? The only way to do that is to only operate as egoists, or we're accepting that there's going to be interlocking factors. So there's certain pragmatic agreements that probably would happen within there. So that would be still a voluntary society, but it wouldn't be a no government society, right?
I gotcha. Well, then it doesn't sound so bad as if if it's a voluntary society. But I guess when I think of I think of the word government as something that's like necessarily coercive, and then but I could see a world where maybe it's there's a voluntary opt-in, and the only way you can live in that place is if you pay the fee and you choose to pay part of the protection money for your iron golem or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then but because it's opt-in and because it's not coercive in the sense like you're forced to pay for the drone striking of children's hospitals even when you don't believe in it. It would be maybe I think you're right there. It would be a stretch to call it a government.
Did you just make an anti-Semitic comment? Did you just attack Israel? Drone striking children hospital. I hope you know that there was 5 Hamas soldiers in there, and so they needed to take it out.
They needed to take it out. Yeah, the children's burn center. there was a Hamas soldier hiding in the dumpster in the back alley, so we needed to drone strike it.
Swear, they fucking look and they're like, 300 fucking kids dead, 600 injured. We got 5 Hamas soldiers.
Yeah,
another victory for freedom, boys.
That's funny, man. You know what? I hate to say it, but we are already an hour and 40 minutes in, and I think
Damn.
real life is beckoning me. I have to start dinner soon, but I feel like there's a lot of material we didn't get a chance to cover, and that
Oh yeah.
we have a lot of things that we could still talk about. So although I think I have to end the conversation for now, if you're interested in maybe sometime in the near future, we can have a part two and we can get into some additional topics because I very much am enjoying your perspective. I feel like you've taught me a few things. I hope I've either taught you or at least the audience a few things
Oh
about the.
well, you've made me think that because usually,
Hmm.
I'll give you my perception of narco-capitalism.
Sure.
Here's where I figured this was going to go through. Here's where I was going to talk to you, and then you were going to come to like a lot of like really idealistic, unpragmatic conclusions, and we'd sort of like butt heads on like, well, would that work actually? And it's like actually, if we just relied on everyone being a perfectly good moral actor,
Yeah.
we could right no so that so usually that's or you were just going to start making everything all the issues about capitalism about minorities like some Hoppian, right? So like usually a lot of the times anarcho-capitalism tends to be like a lot of narco people that call themselves anarcho-capitalists tend to be like I'm really pro freedom, but I don't like non-white people. Like they're just
Mm,
like fascists by a different name, right?
mm,
And so I am friends with some like progressive ANCAPs, but usually the perception there. So you made me
mm.
open my mind that the ANCAP worldview can be a lot more reasonable than I first
Well,
expected.
that's good. And I know what you're saying about the ANCAPs. Of course, I don't think every ANCAP is perfect or correct, and there's a lot of ignorance in any ideological camp, including the ANCAPs. And what I like to do is I'm just fascinated by the dichotomy between left and right because I know that you Ark, you want what's best for the greatest amount of people, and you want to see maximum happiness, maximum
Yes.
prosperity, and I believe that that's what I want to see as well. So I'm just fascinated with how we came to such different conclusions about how that can be achieved. But I'm genuinely interested in the opposing side's perspective, and I feel like I just can't get enough in terms of learning about it. No matter how many books I read and no matter how much I think about it, it always fascinates me, right? Even though I technically think, well, you're mostly wrong, but I would say I agree with a lot of the things you said and a lot of the premises. Not necessarily as many of the conclusions or the type of
So
actions that you
we
come
both
to.
agree there's a problem. We don't necessarily agree on the
Yeah,
prescription.
yeah, but I think your position is refreshing nonetheless. I do like the fact that you seem to make a certain limited amount of room for some kind of market activity in your ideal system. I don't have a problem with like labor unions and stuff like that. So I think the anarcho-syndicalism thing, maybe our ideologies are kind of like brothers or cousins in a way. I really enjoy talking with lib lefts or anyone on the more liberty side of the political compass rather than the authoritarian side.
Oh
So
yeah. Yeah.
I find it invigorating and very interesting. I appreciated a lot of the criticisms that you gave about capitalism, and I like to think that I've heard all of them. I think you may have given me one or two that I might not have heard before, or at least you presented them in a way that in a perspective that I hadn't considered before. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, so one of the issues I have with like a lot of lefties, even like the liberals, like I'd consider them left.
yeah.
As much as I want to vomit in my mouth right now, right? Well, the issue with them is they present like these moralistic perspectives, and they're really good if somebody agrees with you moralistically, or if
Mm,
or they then you can just present a thing. Well, the issue with like okay, so like when we're talking about like billionaires, well, the issue
yeah,
isn't it just be better for poor people to have stuff. Well, that's true,
yeah.
but what matters is the power that is. Like these people are like so fucking powerful, and there's no way to check the bastards without some like insanely powerful state entity. And
Hmm.
oftentimes they just end up sleeping together, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so you essentially come to like a lot of these prescriptions that come to like whereas my moral worldview is based upon a moral prescription, it also is founded on like pragmatism, like accepting that certain things have to work a certain way or you're
Hmm.
gonna get murked, right?
I
And
like
so yeah,
that.
that's why I think because I'm able to present these heavily moralistic topics in a values neutral way, and that's why I think I'm uniquely suited
Mm-hmm.
in a way to talk to people that don't agree with me, because
Mm.
I'm not going to give you like, well, the boss is a parasitic leash and we need to free the proletariat, class war now. um
Yeah,
like no, and so I'll
just the
leave you with this:
rhetoric.
never allow the authoritarians to call you an idealist. It is they who are ideal because they believe people in positions of authority will act benevolently.
Ooh, good point.
Anyway, goodbye.
Yeah.
Good
All right.
good talk to you. Talk to you again.
All right. Thanks. All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed it. Hopefully, we'll get a part two sometime in the future. Let me know what you think in the comments below. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? What did Ark get really well? Where do you think he got something wrong? Love to hear your feedback. I'll get another debate lined up soon. Thanks for watching.